Welcome to the Jurassic Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park, and also not that too. In this clip from episode 32, Control, the executive director and co-founder for the Institute for Liberal Studies and the executive producer for the Curious Task podcast, and my terrific guest, Matt Bufton, shares his thoughts on the political and economic structures that author Michael Crichton has employed to create a world in which Jurassic Park could become a reality. I'll first premise our interview with an excerpt from episode 14, Target of Opportunity, where a bit more context is provided regarding the political and economic atmosphere in which Biosyn was executing a plan to perform corporate espionage and corporate theft from InGen as well. So to start, here's a description on an allusion Crichton employs in the chapter Target of Opportunity. There's some interesting allusions and references in this chapter. The Supreme Court's Harvard University decision. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Harvard in 1987, which is a real thing, on April 21st in 1987. That was when I was 6, and we were celebrating my mom's birthday. The Supreme Court okays patents for new life forms. From this point on, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office could accept patent applications for animals, the first of which was awarded to Harvard University a year later. This was the Onco mouse, a mouse researchers produced to be especially susceptible to getting cancer. 3 decades later, the government has issued about 800 animal patents on everything, says an article I found while researching on this subject at wired.com. An interesting addendum to this allusion is an article found at digitalcommons.law.on.edu, which says there are 3 common types of people who oppose the patenting of multicellular animal life. 1. Animal welfare groups concerned about experimentation on laboratory animals. 2. Farm groups concerned about the possible domination of animal genetic stock by a limited number of individuals. And 3. Watchdog groups who are simply opposed to genetic research. The article continues reading, the most vociferous opposition has come from the 3rd category, headed by Jeremy Rifkin, a president of the Foundation of Economic Trends. He has spearheaded a coalition of groups, including several animal welfare organizations, and petitioned the Patent and Trademark Office to reverse its newly adopted policy. The petition apparently did not make a dramatic impression upon the Patent and Trademark Office because a patent was subsequently issued on a genetically engineered mouse. The strong opinions voiced by these various opponents to animal patenting range from a fear of increased suffering and pain for laboratory mice to a fear of the end of the natural world. Hey! This is starting to sound like Crichton's essay in the introduction, the InGen incident that we covered in episode 1. And I'm fairly confident that Crichton was familiar with this Jeremy Rifkin. Much of what's described of Mr. Rifkin's objections to the unregulated development of biotechnology appears to fall in line with some of the objections identified in Crichton's introduction. Here's an excerpt from episode 1, Introduction, to summarize the issues Crichton raises. Today we're going over Introduction, the InGen incident. As a synopsis, this is an essay by Crichton that outlines that biotechnology and genetic engineering have been rushed with furious haste for profits. The biotechnology revolution differs in 3 important respects from past scientific transformations. 1, it is broad-based. 500 corporations spend $5 billion a year on biotechnology. 2, much of the research is thoughtless or frivolous. And 3, the work is uncontrolled. Most concerning, quote, no watchdogs are found among scientists themselves, unquote. Scientists are no more ethical in pursuing science than the capitalists pursuing the science. The whimsical use of biotechnology should concern us all, and everyone is a stakeholder. Science is no longer pursued for the betterment of mankind, Crichton argues. Galileo proceeded with, quote, science as a free and open inquiry into the workings of nature, unquote. Scientists traditionally operated above politics and war, rebelling against secrecy in research and frowning upon patents, working for the betterment of all mankind. Crichton labels a clear moment when the betterment of all switched to patents for profits, April 1976. Venture capitalist Robert Swanson bankrolled biochemist Herbert Boyer, or Hubert Boyer, or however that's pronounced, and those are both real people, to launch Genentech, a real business whose Wikipedia page includes no mention of Jurassic Park. They, standing on the shoulders of giants, those giants being British researchers James Watson and Francis Crick, who deciphered the structure of DNA, launched a trend-setting, gene-splicing new world of genetic engineering enterprise. This led to a, quote, significant shift in attitude, says Crichton. So the article regarding Rifkin specifically mentions that watchdog groups are particularly among those who are against patenting multicellular animal life. And one of Crichton's assertions in his introduction is what's most concerning is that, quote, no watchdogs are found among scientists themselves. This lack of oversight or governance in the development of biotechnology is what permits something like Jurassic Park to happen, according to Crichton. A lot of what Crichton is talking about in this book is voiced through the character Malcolm. We're going to get another chapter named Control later on in the novel, but basically it boils down to this concept that there is a power involved here, and that power is being used or wielded frivolously or carelessly, and that generally to acquire power, one must be disciplined. Crichton and Malcolm both bring up this subject in another chapter called Control on page 306. Malcolm says, I'll tell you what I'm talking about. Most kinds of power require a substantial sacrifice by whoever wants the power. There is an apprenticeship, a discipline lasting many years. Whatever kind of power you want, president of the company, black belt in karate, spiritual guru, whatever you seek, you have to put in the time, the practice, the effort. You must give up a lot to get it. It has to be very important to you. And once you have attained it, it is your power. It can't be given away. It resides in you. It is literally the result of your discipline. He goes on to say that science operates a little bit differently. Scientific power and the results of scientific progress are given you because you stand on the shoulders of giants, that you build upon the work of your predecessors, which is how science works. But I guess Crichton is suggesting that the power that is obtained through standing on the shoulders of the giants, the people that came before you, is eliminating that internal discipline that may have caused you to be cautious or respectful of the power. Instead, you might operate whimsically with the advances that are given to you to move forwards with. And then Malcolm continues, and because you can stand on the shoulders of giants, you can accomplish something quickly. You don't even know exactly what you've done, but you've already reported it, patented it, and sold it. You remember Malcolm does this in the film too. And the buyer will have even less discipline than you. The buyer simply purchases the power like any commodity. The buyer doesn't even conceive that any discipline might be necessary. And that's a buyer. I recall that we're talking about buyers in stealing this power. They would have, you would believe, even less respect for this power. Hammond, of course, doesn't want to hear about this. He says, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about. Malcolm says, I'll make it simple. A karate master does not kill people with his bare hands. He does not lose his temper and kill his wife. A person who kills is the person who has no discipline, no restraint, and who has purchased his power in the form of a Saturday night special. And that is the kind of power that science fosters and permits. And that is why you think that to build a place like this is simple. But it was simple, Hammond insisted. Then why did it go so wrong? That's on page 306 and 7. All right, let's get back to the subject here. How has the real world dealt with this subject? As mentioned before, here's part of my conversation with the executive director and co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Studies, Matt Bufton. So you're absolutely right. I approached you to be on the podcast because of the first chapters in the book, and there's so much in conversation about intrusive governmental agencies, frustrating regulations and approvals, and all kinds of problems that businesses face getting their products to market. And that feels like a libertarian perspective, that there should be more freedoms involved. But at the same time, the novel opens with, these accusations in the introduction saying that, unbridled capitalism is going to literally change the face of the earth for the worse. The capitalist in this novel is shown in kind of a poor light. Hammond isn't a hero by any stretch of the means. And it's a common sense to do frivolous things with science, that because ethical things are too much of a hassle and it's too regulated, it's too hard to make money doing important things. So it's a fantasy that doesn't really, if you think about it too hard, doesn't work, but it works for the novel. But I guess from your perspective, what's an economic look at what's being argued for in the novel look like to you?
In some ways, this novel feels a bit like one of those ink blots where you look at it and what you see reveals more about yourself than what's actually in the ink blot. So, like you mentioned the part about not doing the thing that is good,
Mm-hmm.
which is Hammond sort of says it would be silly to try and cure cancer, because if you could, you'll be forced to give it away for free. And so you do something like build a dinosaur park, because then you won't be forced to give it away for free.
Naturally, yes.
And I think Crichton writes that as a condemnation of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we get with the capitalist economy. but I read it as a condemnation of government, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we let the market play its course, there's a huge financial reward to curing cancer. When the government comes in and wants to punish the person who has cured cancer by taking away the profits that they would have earned, that's a problem with government. Now, I don't think it's the case that like someone could cure cancer and is not doing it because they're worried about what's going to happen with the government, making them give it away. But I think it does sort of reduce the incentives on the margins. I think I've read some things about how vaccine technology was underinvested in the years leading up to COVID. Now I think there's probably a lot more investment in vaccine development than there was. But leading up to that, there was this idea that if you had a vaccine for a disease, especially in the third world, that you would be pressured to give it away, which is what we saw a lot with things like medication for AIDS and HIV. You make a breakthrough, and then there's just this massive both government and social pressure that it's very expensive. People in Africa who need it can't afford it, and so you've got to give it away for free or at a very low cost. And if you're the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, it's nice to do good things for people, but you need to make money to stay in business. And so not that you sit on a cure for cancer, but maybe you just don't look at it as closely and spend as much time on it as you might. So I think Hammond makes a really interesting point. But to me, the point that ends up being made is the exact opposite one from what I think Crichton intends when he writes that.
That's very interesting. The Rorschach analogy is fascinating. I like that.
Yeah.
So furthermore, in the novel, as a synopsis, the introduction is an essay by Crichton that outlines that biotechnology and genetic engineering have been rushed with furious haste and for profits, that their goals there are always to make money. And I recall that many of these arguments were being made as the internet was coming on board, that the internet was like this wild west, a new frontier, and they were going to need new laws, but they didn't know what they were going to be because they didn't know how the internet was going to operate. And geographically, the laws of the land didn't necessarily apply to where the websites were. So the Cayman Islands or the Swiss bank accounts was the internet. The internet could be anywhere. And so I think that he was maybe digging into that atmosphere. We don't know what to expect, how to regulate it. I guess you just have to have faith in the morality of people who are operating. But we know that they're rushing things, and we know that they're driven just by making money. So I guess that's to think that those are their only ambitions, and that they're being frivolous. Those are the three arguments. And I think when he describes the biotech world, he's describing John Hammond as well. These are he's the personification of that almost perfectly. I don't know, and we're kind of in that realm now with cryptocurrencies where it's still, I would say, broadly misunderstood by most, including me, and but out there and running around and with consequences. It sounds like people are losing quite a bit of money investing in these things. But at the same time, I guess it sounds like people are getting very rich too. I don't know. But when you get into a new realm like this, what is the best process by which you begin to provide the oversight or the regulations? Do you just listen to your heart, or what's the best way to go about entering into these new worlds?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would have a point of view on that. It's probably different from most of your listeners. That I would say, either you should not regulate at all, or have a very light sort of regulatory touch on these things. I mean, I think it's interesting that Crichton is writing, just before the internet becomes a daily force in our lives, and yet he says in that introduction that biotechnology will have a greater effect on our daily lives than computers. Now, if we just think of the internet as an add-on to computers, to me that seems obviously false right now. I mean, we do see a lot of stuff with biotech, and maybe some of the food in your kitchen. Maybe we'll go to the doctor and you'll get some medicine that's related to this biotech stuff. But the internet, I mean, we're only having this conversation because of the internet. The medium of podcasts only exists because of the internet. I don't know about you, but I feel like with us, almost every day a box shows up at the door. We got our toilet paper and our dish soap from Amazon now because it's so easy to just subscribe and they deliver it once a month or whatever we need. So Crichton is expressing, first of all, this prediction about the impact of biotechnology being greater than computers, which I think is wrong. He also, I think writes Jurassic Park as a bit of a warning, perhaps, about the problems that these fields are unregulated. I don't know a lot about the specific regulations about biotechnology. I mean, it seems to me that it is probably a field with a lot of regulations, but in some ways, maybe not. And yet, I don't think Crichton's fears have sort of come to pass. I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, but I think there's a chance that COVID is a lab leak from China. Not to say that it's probable. It's entirely possible that we will never know for sure either way. If we ever do know, then I think will be some time before that comes to light. But it's at least a possibility. And if it is the case, then it was not a lab leak from some private company that was irresponsibly doing something. It was a lab leak that was under the supervision of the biggest government, one of the biggest governments in the world, right? So the idea that we will have these horrible consequences if we don't have enough regulations on biotech, I would just, if Crichton was still alive, to ask him, I would be interested to say, do you think you were wrong about your prediction? Because I look around and I don't see any disastrous consequences coming from biotech. I mean, we've got, new foods that can be very important. Some cases when it comes to farming, some are a bit frivolous. You can buy these like grapes that taste like cotton candy at the store right now, which seems strange to me.
I haven't tried those.
Probably biotech involved in there somewhere. But I would describe most biotech that I see as either very beneficial or sort of neutral. And I'm just not aware. Maybe of examples of cases where this has gone wrong. I don't.
The only thing I can think of, I think there's a risk. I suppose, like in the analog of a viral leak, that something could escape a lab and affect the food supply or affect extinct a species and disrupt the food chain, or be very contagious and harm a lot of people. So I suppose that there's possibilities, but it seems like people got take proper precautions. The responsibility of handling these things isn't being taken whimsically. Even if the concept of what you're doing may have been whimsical, it seems like people are pretty strict about the consequences of being responsible. It feels that way. And it seems like there's the taboo that you don't clone people. That seems to be the one thing that they've just universally, unless there's some Cayman Island where the rules don't apply and they have a bunch of cloned people over there, I don't know. But that seems to be one that the world has agreed. If we start cloning things, we're not going to clone people.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like we can imagine things that would go bad, right? Someone's messing around with viruses. Seem like a very obvious candidate now. Something gets out, something goes wrong, and yet it hasn't happened. And this is something that I see a lot of times in government regulations. A government will pass a regulation or a law, and they will say, "Well, we're doing this in case this bad thing happens." Which can be reasonable, but we should always be acknowledging the cost of these laws and regulations and thinking, okay, is there a danger that the bad thing might happen, or is this just something that we're sort of imagining? Which I don't think we do. I don't think we do enough. To give one example, and perhaps a fairly minor one, but it's back to school season recently. You probably saw Facebook friends. Maybe you did this. With your child holding a sign that says, "I'm this years old, I'm in grade whatever at this school. These are the things I like." And some police departments were posting a warning about doing this and saying, an abductor could use this information to find your child and then take their love of dinosaurs to lure them into the van and abduct them, right? And we can imagine that might happen. But I look at that and my first thought is has this ever happened? Because almost all child abductions are non-custodial parents. People, and sometimes there are tragic results. But overwhelmingly, when a child is kidnapped, it's because someone who loves them doesn't get to see them as much as they want to because of a relationship that's fallen apart. And they just want to spend time with their children. So in a world where children are being kidnapped as a result of back-to-school posts, then maybe we pass an advisory. Maybe there's even a regulation that says you can't make back-to-school posts anymore because they're so dangerous. But I don't think we live in that world. No. I've never actually read about a case where a child was abducted in that manner.
Let's hope that doesn't happen. But yeah, I recall too, put your kids' names on everything so that when they can get it back, like if they ever drop it somewhere. But also don't put their name available so people can see it because they get abducted. So it's a bit of both, right? Which that sounds like laws to me. They always seem to say one thing and not another, which I guess keeps lawyers very rich. I feel like we've moved out of a world where it used to be, buyer beware. Do your research, take a lot of information, compare notes and stuff like that, get the reputation of a business before you buy anything. Buyer beware. Whereas it seems like now you buy it and you expect that it's going to be exactly what you want, and you don't feel like it's possibly not going to be any good unless you get it from the dollar store, and you're like, it's just a dollar store. What do you expect? But like, we even got like the Consumer Report segments on the news where like somebody did them dirty, and the guy gets with a microphone and he's like, open your door and talk to me about this problem. Consuming, buying, purchasing, is it regulations that have changed it into that, or have people just got more faith in the system, or the means of production has changed? Like, what do you suppose is the reason that we've moved away from the snake oil salesman to I expect I'm getting exactly what I want when I buy something?
Yeah, I think there's a accurate description there that a lot of things that at one point we would have done ourselves or belonged to some sort of group or association to do, we now look to government to do. And sometimes that means we don't pay enough attention as the way that we should, because we think that this will be handled by regulation. I think a lot of times it leads to us getting sort of substandard things. So, you and I have lived our entire lives in a society in which healthcare is provided for by the government. Almost all education is provided by the government. There's a very large degree of, social safety net, welfare provided by the government. There's also a large dissatisfaction with how these things are done, especially now. If we look at the past 2 years of the pandemic, you can hardly pick up a newspaper, if you were so old-fashioned that you would pick up a newspaper, without reading about problems in the healthcare system, problems in education, with the parents unhappy with how the schools are treating the pandemic, or how the teachers are unhappy, complaints that the social payments that are made to people who can't work are not appropriate, not enough, not keeping up with inflation, going to the wrong people, whatever it is. And yet I think that there's a general sort of societal attitude, well, that's the way things are. The government has to do these things. Also, they don't do a very good job, but what could we possibly do about it? And as a libertarian, to me, this is kind of frustrating, because this is my embodiment of the complaints, right? Mm-hmm. The reason I don't want education and healthcare run by the government is not because I don't want poor people to have them. Because I believe everybody would get more and better of those things if we took them out of government hands. Mm-hmm. And there was a time, when these things were done without government. Education and healthcare existed before the state provided them, though I think for many of us, it's hard to imagine how that could be the case. And then this extends to things like consumer goods and regulations. We just imagine that everything is being checked out, and they wouldn't allow them to sell it to us if it wasn't safe. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes that's not true. There's a journalist named John Stossel, who some people may know. He was on 2020 for a number of years. And he was an award-winning consumer reporter, made his reputation by dropping off a TV that was not broken. Again, very old-fashioned concept. Right. The idea of taking a TV to a repairman to fix. But they would take a working TV, they would drop it off, they'd come and pick it up, and the repair guy would say, yeah, I had to fix the whatever it was. You got to pay me $75. And they did this to 10 TV repair stores around town, and then went to confront them on camera about lying about how they fixed the TV. And Stossel got so famous and well known for doing this that he would get calls the week after one of his specials aired by politicians. He's an American, so usually Congress people, say, I'm horrified by these unscrupulous TV repairmen, and so we're going to pass a regulation to monitor TV repair industry. And what Stossel noticed was that you never got rid of the scam artists. You pass these regulations, now the honest TV repair people have to get licensed or have government inspections or whatever it is, And then the guys who are scammers just move on to a new scam. And so the regulations are never able to accomplish their stated goals, and we just pile up more and more of these as we go along the way. It was a very long answer to your question.
They never seem to take laws away, do they? They never seem to take anything back. You still can't drag a dead mule down Yonge Street on Sunday or something like that.
Exactly.
Because what? They're going to suddenly let people do that now? Can't take that rule out. So we do get Hammond evading the government as best as he can. That's why he sets up on a leased island outside the coast of Costa Rica. But the EPA is still interested in catching him. I mean, we know the EPA is the villains of Ghostbusters, and the villain in the Simpsons movie. The Environmental Protection Agency is a curse on the American working man, and probably other 80s movies as well. So they were concerned there's, quote, no evidence of Hammond doing any wrong. They're just suspicious, and so they're snooping after him. But they're pretty clear that he's, quote, evading the law, and there must be military concerns. Why else would he need supercomputers and gene sequences or sophisticated things like that? So they believe that these things are all dangerous in the wrong hands, and so the government is going to go and decide that whether his hands are wrong or not. And for what it's worth, like, them snooping around did in a way get the security report to be, I guess, moving along. So Gennaro brings all the inspectors to the island to do the safety inspection. Sort of, this kind of pressed their hand to do it. So I guess there was something good being done there. But like, again, in a world where a guy's doing something recklessly, if it's not the government that's looking over him, what is the best function of assembling watchdogs or things like that when there is a concern that should, be addressed?
Yeah. The watchdog, one is going to be tricky, right? Now, maybe you should have some sort of industry group, Cloners International or something. They would have a big conference, and they would have some sort of self-governing body. One thing I think is probably important to mention that is, as a libertarian, my position is not that if we take away the regulations, everything will work perfectly and there'll never be any problems. There still, of course, we live in a world of imperfect humans, and there will be problems. The sort of question is, well, did the EPA really, make things better? Is there a system that would be effective at providing some sort of oversight or governance? And maybe the most effective oversight in Hammond's case is investors. Mm-hmm. They are now they seem to be sort of triggered by the investigations of the EPA. Mm-hmm. But perhaps that the lawyers, the investors who are getting nervous is the oversight. And you mentioned sort of experimentation a while ago, and I drew the analogy of like failed businesses. Mm-hmm. And I will say that in Hammond's case, it's very largely the fact that it goes wrong, but like he pays the ultimate price in the book, mm-hmm. right? He is hoist on his own petard, I think is the line from Shakespeare, that like his horrible experiment gone awry. Yes, it hurts and kills other people, but also he is the victim mm-hmm. of it. Maybe that is sort of the at least in a literary sense, the appropriate outcome. That he is the victim of his own hubris.
Mm-hmm. That's true. He does get there is some poetic justice there, because and Crichton makes sure that you read it that way, because just before he meets his end, he's saying he's doubling down. He's like, I'm going to build another. No, I'll build 3 more, and I'm going to have better people. Everybody I had sucked. Yeah, I'll be even richer. And then he gets eaten. So Crichton
he hasn't learned his lesson, right? And it's, he's a fictional character, so I don't think we can say whether that is realistic or not, because that's just part of who he is in the novel. Mm-hmm. But I will say, in a sort of real world, sort of entrepreneurial sense, you have people who make a mistake and then they make the mistake 5 more times. Mm-hmm. And those people just tend not to be successful. The entrepreneurs that we know, I mean, look at Steve Jobs, all the mistakes that he made with Apple, and yet I just learned from them in some way to make Apple into one of the biggest companies in the world. I was once at a conference, and Jimmy Wales, I think is his name, the guy who started Wikipedia, talks, and Wikipedia is a very sort of, in a sense, thing that Hayek would have approved of, this sort of spontaneous order of just letting like thousands of people write down their thoughts. And you might think, no, we need experts to say what should be in there. But it turns out you got a pretty good product, not a perfect product, but a pretty good product by just sort of crowdsourcing this thing. But before Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales had like a similar project in which he would pay experts to write these things. And apparently he would pay like $10,000 for someone to write, the entry on dinosaurs or something like that. It was a complete failure. But he claimed that he kept these entries that he had commissioned in his like nightstand so we could read them every day in an attempt to get back some of the money that he had spent on them. And I don't know if that was true or just a funny story, but it was a funny story.
I've read Jurassic Park a lot of times, but I don't think $10,000 worth of times. You have to read those every night, I think, for a while.
Yeah.
So we see that Hammond, again, leaves the States to escape the rules and the oversights. Do you think that that's happening a lot? We hear about brain drain, where people are lured away because they aren't getting what they need, or what they feel what they should get. Do you find that there are a lot of people that are escaping? Is it just monetary, or are there regulations you think that are stopping people, maybe moving businesses away? It sounds like taxation is the major factor that leads people away, but are there other rules and regulations? I know, what did I just hear? I was reading, so Harvard won a lawsuit to patent cancer, especially cancerous mouse called the oncomouse. They developed a mouse that gets cancer, and so they can test cancer stuff on it. And they patented I can't say that word, the mouse. And the U.S. let them, but Canada doesn't let them in. So they can't do that research in Canada for some reason. So they said the animal itself can't be, you can patent the process and the methodology, but the animal itself is not a product. You can't do that. So Canada didn't let them do it. Are there examples where people are moving away because regulations are stopping them from doing things? I suppose like labor laws, maybe?
Yeah. I would say we see this all the time, right? Anytime a company sets up a business somewhere, especially something like Amazon, where a few years ago we saw them building this great big secondary headquarters, and all the governments were falling all over themselves to give them tax breaks and things like that, which I would certainly not support. But that is a result of companies will look at where to go. People look at where to go. Taxes, like you say, are going to be a big thing. Regulations are definitely going to impact things. Look at the cannabis industry, which exploded a few years ago. It was in Canada, not in the U.S., because you couldn't legally grow cannabis.
That's right.
In the U.S. I think now maybe you can in some states, although it's still federally illegal. So maybe you can't.
Yeah,
I'm actually not sure.
Some states, yes, but I don't think you can cross the border. There's a bunch. Yeah, it's still complicated.
yeah, and one other example of that would be the fact that when my dad moved to Canada in 1976, Montreal was the business capital of Canada, the biggest city in Canada, and businesses fled there not so much because of taxes and regulations, but because of political uncertainty that Quebec was going to separate. And if Quebec separated, they want Royal Bank still wanted to be in Canada, not in some other country. So of course they kept branches in Montreal and Quebec, but they moved their headquarters to Toronto, as many big corporations did. So yeah, people will always. Economists will say people respond to incentives. So corporations are just sort of masses of people, and they will respond to laws, regulations, incentives of any sort, and you can never get away from that.
That's so fascinating. The episode of the podcast that just came out this morning, The Curious Task, I forget the name of your great guest, but he was talking about how businesses and the economy sort of serve as a representation of people. It's fascinating. Businesses represent kind of a macro perspective on the behavior of people. So what they buy and how they spend their money and stuff like that shows who they are in a way. And it connects so well with what exactly you're talking about. That these regulations and stuff like that change people, not just businesses. It's interesting.
Yep, absolutely, and that's there's this idea that you businesses or government can pass these laws and then they will just have the desired effect, and of course they do not mention marijuana. I mean, drug policy is a great example of this. The fact when you make drugs illegal, you have all of these things. You bring criminals into the drug trade. You affect the types of drugs that are being produced, and any government regulation or law is going to affect people's behavior in some way.
So have you guys had, I don't know how famous this guy is, but it looks like he's been around for a long, long time. And I think that a lot of the concerns that Crichton employed writing this book were based on an economist named Jeremy Rifkin, who apparently is an advocate in the States who is really against the use of new biopatents and biotech in farming. And he founded the Foundation of Economic Trends and spearheaded a coalition of groups who feared that biotech would be, the end of the natural world. And when I looked him up, I thought he was just like some, like, I don't mean any disrespect, just an angry farmer who was like, you can't do this is my land. But he sounds like an extraordinarily well-organized economist who's published all kinds of stuff. And of course he is. Why would he be something other than that? So I feel like he was really worried about these new fields, and there must be a lot of anxiety for people who know that the scam artist is there, that they are just moving from one to the next, and you got to kind of, like, I don't know, beat the rug to get them out of there. What's the safest way to enter into a new market? Or like you're right, with cannabis stores, they popped up fast and people were whole hog right into that. Like, we have a small town, we might have 5 dispensaries in town. It's unbelievable. What's the safest way to enter into a new market or explore these? Is it just experimentation, or?
I would say, yeah. And, same here, I'm in Ottawa, and the number of cannabis stores, I can only think that there's going to be, I think it's already started, but it seems like there needs to be a big correction in the market. Like, we have too many of these, yeah. Right? But it's really interesting to me, the idea that, for most of our lives, cannabis was this drug that was so dangerous that we had to stop people from having it, and when people tried to sell it, they needed to be put in jail. Mm-hmm. Of course, that wasn't my belief as a libertarian, and it wasn't a lot of people's belief. But as a general society, that was the law, and a lot of people had that belief. And then all of a sudden, it becomes a thing where we need the provincial government to be buying and growing and selling cannabis, which of course they ended up doing a bad job of. And I would say this is part of my concern, going back to things like regulation, that you have this industry where all of a sudden you go from banning it to having this regulated, in some ways supported and subsidized kind of way. And I would lean much more to just let people do what they want to do, as long as they're not harming other people. Mm-hmm. So, people want to grow and sell marijuana, that's fine. Maybe you have a labeling requirement so people know what they're consuming. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem unreasonable. Although there's going to be problems with how it's actually done, most likely. Things like Bitcoin, which I wish I'd gotten into when I first heard about it. I was at a conference with a Bitcoin ATM 10 years ago, and they were $30 a Bitcoin. Oh, yeah? But I also just didn't and still don't really understand how it works. So I missed making my fortune that way. There's a lot of talk about, sort of regulating Bitcoin. I don't know how that would work. But I just want to let people do the things that they want to do. So I know people who love Bitcoin and think it's the best thing in the world. I think they should be free to buy it. I know a lot of people who think it's a scam and have no interest in it. Of course, they should be free not to buy it and not to have it. Yeah. And the idea that all of these things, the government needs to tell us what is safe, what is unsafe, what is a good investment, what is a bad investment. Mm-hmm. I'm just very cynical about it, as you would expect.
All right, that's consequential stuff we're talking about there, or he's talking about, I'm listening to. Vigilance and justice, and trying to prevent injustices before they occur through regulations. When you look at the Rorschach test that is Jurassic Park, do you see condemnation of capitalism? Do you see a condemnation of government? I think there's an argument to be made that Crichton intends you to see a condemnation of science. And who are the watchdogs standing vigilant over how businesses operate, how science operates? Who are the watchdogs standing vigilant over how governments respond to these businesses or these developments in science? And who watches the watchdogs? All right. Thank you to my great guest, Matt Bufton, for sharing his expertise for the show. Thanks to all the watchdogs out there standing vigilant against injustices. And thank you for tuning in to the Jurassic Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast, where we talk about the novel Jurassic Park, and also Not That Too. If you're interested in more of the podcast, you can find it wherever podcasts are sold, although this one is free, so buyer beware. And just look for Juras-Sick Park-Cast. There's a hyphen in between Ass-Sick and Park-Cast. Include those hyphens if you're looking, or Jurassic Park podcast. That might work too. You're looking around. And if you like this video here, you can like and subscribe for more when they come out. There's lots more to come. Stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.